Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're doing a rapid-fire crash course in the fundamentals of criminology. Ever wondered what actually makes something a crime? Or why crime even happens in the first place? Well, we're going to dive right in and explore all of it. Okay, so let's just kick things off with the most fundamental question of all. What actually is a crime? At its most basic, a crime is any action, or get this, even a failure to act, that officially breaks a society's written laws. So, if it's on the books and you do it, you've committed a crime. Simple as that. But, not all rule breaking is technically a crime. There's this other concept called deviance. This is all about breaking society's unwritten rules and norms. Like talking on your phone super loudly in a quiet cafe. It'll definitely get you some dirty looks, but it's not going to land you in jail. And this brings us to a really crucial distinction. A crime is actually a type of deviance. Think about it. Theft breaks a written law, but it also breaks a huge unwritten social rule. But something like, say, having a really unusual fashion sense, that's just deviant. It goes against the norm, but it's not illegal. So here's the key takeaway. All crime is a form of deviance, but not all deviance is a crime. So here's our game plan. We'll start by looking at how crime gets categorized. Then we'll get into the wild idea that crime is actually a social construct. After that, we'll tackle the huge question of why it happens by exploring some major theories. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at the impact of crime and how we perceive it. All right, let's jump right into section 1, the categories of crime. Because, as you'll see, not all crimes are created equal in the eyes of the justice system. So one way police look at crime is by its impact. At the bottom, you have what they call volume crime. These are the high-frequency things like vandalism that really drain police resources. A step up from that, you have serious crime, which might involve organized groups or big financial gains. And then right at the top, you have major crime, the most severe acts that have just devastating consequences. Now, the legal system has its own way of sorting things out. In England, for example, offenses are split into 3 tiers. Minor stuff, summary offenses like speeding, are handled quickly in a magistrate's court. The most serious offenses, indictable only, like murder, have to go to the Crown Court. And then you've got this middle category, triable either way, which could go to either court. And this is all absolutely critical because it determines where you're tried and what the maximum punishment could be. But that begs the question, right? Who even decides what gets put into these categories? And that leads us to our next section, this fascinating idea that crime isn't some fixed universal truth. It's what's known as a social construct. So what on earth does social construct actually mean? Well, it means the idea of crime isn't a law of nature like gravity. It's an idea that we, as a society, created and agreed upon. It's kind of like money. A piece of paper only has value because we all agree it does. Crime works the same way. An act is only criminal because we've all decided to label it and legislate it that way. And because crime is a social construct, its definition is always changing. What we consider criminal can shift dramatically depending on the time period, the specific situation, the culture you're in, or even how old someone is. And here's a perfect example. Cocaine was once a totally legal medicine. You could buy it over the counter. But as our scientific knowledge and our social values changed, society completely redefined it. What was once perfectly fine became a serious crime. It just goes to show you how much these definitions can evolve. So that leads us to the biggest question of all, right? Why do people commit crimes in the first place? Well, there's no easy answer, so let's take a whirlwind tour through some of the major theories. So some of the earliest theories have a pretty surprising take. Thinkers like Emil Durkheim argued that a certain amount of crime is actually normal and maybe even necessary for healthy society. Then Robert Merton came along with his famous strain theory. He said, look, society pushes this goal of wealth and success on everyone, but it doesn't give everyone the same legitimate tools to achieve it. That creates a strain. And for some people, crime becomes an alternative way to get what they've been told to want. Other theories look at our environment for answers. The Chicago School, for instance, found that crime rates were way higher in unstable, transitional parts of cities. Then you've got the famous broken windows theory, which says that visible signs of decay, like a single broken window, can send a signal that nobody cares, which then attracts even more crime. Research has even shown that housing policies can accidentally create crime hotspots by concentrating poverty in one area. Now, conflict theories get straight to the point. They argue that the root cause of crime is inequality, pure and simple. When a society is deeply unbalanced, with huge power on one side and marginalization on the other, crime is often the result. And these theories highlight a really painful irony. The most disadvantaged communities are often both the main perpetrators and the main victims of crime. Gender, of course, plays a huge role too. Some theories explore what's called hegemonic masculinity, this idea that men feel this immense pressure to be tough and dominant and might turn to crime to prove it. Feminist approaches, on the other hand, show how patriarchal systems can actually hide crimes like domestic violence, keeping them out of sight. And other theories look at how we socialize boys and girls differently, which could influence their likelihood of offending later on. And then you have the incredibly powerful idea of labeling theory. This theory says it's not just about what you do, it's about what society calls you. So step 1, someone gets a label, like criminal. Step 2, people start reacting to that label, not to the actual person. Step 3, the person starts to believe the label themselves. And step 4, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The label becomes their main identity, their master status, and they start living up to it. Okay, so we've looked at what crime is and why it might happen. For our final section, let's turn to the consequences. What's the impact of crime on victims, and how do our perceptions and punishments shape this whole thing? You know, the way we even think about victims has changed a lot. Early approaches, sometimes called positivist victimology, tended to focus on the individual, asking things like, what makes someone a target, which unfortunately sometimes led to victim blaming. But modern critical victimology completely flips that. It looks at the bigger picture, arguing that systemic issues like poverty and powerlessness make entire groups of people more vulnerable to begin with. So what about punishment? What's it all for? Well, the main goal is always to maintain social order. But how it does that is up for debate. For some, punishment is about retribution, an eye for an eye, to reinforce society's moral lines. For others, the focus is on restorative justice, which is all about repairing the harm done. But no matter the approach, punishment is society's main tool for dealing with crime. And of course, we absolutely have to talk about the media. The way crime gets shown on the news and in movies often creates this wildly exaggerated picture. This can stir up a lot of public fear, create harmful stereotypes, and lead to this huge gap between the reality of crime and how scared we actually feel. And that really brings us full circle, right back to that core idea from Howard Becker, that our perception, our reaction, and the labels we use are just as important as the act itself. So we're left with this one last, pretty challenging question. If what we call crime is defined by our society, shaped by our environment, and reinforced by the labels we slap on people, what does that truly say about the very idea of a criminal?